Here on the ground, change happens fast. Problems feel frequent and urgent. It's loud and anxiety runs high. From a satellite view, the Earth looks the same as it did thousands of years ago. We've been here before. Let's learn from our past and shoot for a better future.
Hello again and welcome back to A Satellite View. I'm Todd Mikkelson speaking at you from January 29th, 2023 in the space and time continuum. Again, tons going on. Everything's crazy and out of control. I do want to talk about this whole Durham thing. There was an article that came out this week, a couple days ago, in the New York Times, written by Katie Benner, Adam Goldman, and Charlie Savage, very good investigative journalists, who really uncovered some unbelievable but believable. Again, we're surprised, but we're not surprised. But the level of criminality in the Republican Party is just staggering at the moment, and they seem to still think that they can just keep getting away with things. The way they began thinking they can get away with things 50 years ago. And as you know, in A Satellite View here, we like to go back and cover the bases of the current stories, look at some history to see how things got so crazy. In 1968, the Vietnam War had been going on for too long with too many casualties, with no clear reason why we were there or if it was possible to win. Most Americans already thought it to be an unnecessary and immoral war, and protests against it were growing. President Lyndon Johnson was making a deal with the South Vietnamese to end the war, with upcoming talks to take place in Paris. Richard Nixon, who was running as the Republican presidential candidate in 1968, feared that success in those peace talks would cause him to lose the election. Now, the FBI had bugged the telephone of the South Vietnamese ambassador, and they recorded a telephone call from somebody by the name of Anna Chenault, a Nixon senior campaign advisor. On the tapes these bugs produced, Chenault can be heard convincing the ambassador that the South Vietnamese government should pull out of those peace talks, stop dealing with Johnson, and if Nixon were elected, they'd get a much better deal. On the eve of his announcement of a halt to the bombing in North Vietnam, President Johnson learned that the South Vietnamese were pulling out of the peace talks. Unbelievable story, right? Why did we not know about this sooner? There's audio tape of it. Well, the recorded evidence the Johnson administration had gathered would have sunk the Nixon campaign, but Johnson decided it wasn't worth revealing because it would also reveal that the FBI were bugging the ambassador's phone, and that therefore the NSA was intercepting his communications with Saigon. Also, just a few weeks before Election Day, Democratic presidential nominee Hubert Humphrey was poised to win the election. So Johnson didn't think it was worth it to announce that a presidential nominee was committing treason. Nixon committed treason in order to win his first presidential election. Here's what Nixon did in the final days of his campaigning. He suggested that the Democratic administration's war policy was in such bad shape that they couldn't even get the South Vietnamese, who we were there to help, to come to the negotiating table. He won the election by less than 1% of the popular vote. The war went on even though Nixon promised to end the war. That's what his campaign was all about. But instead, he escalated the war into Laos and Cambodia. It resulted in 22,000 more American lives lost. Privately, Johnson and others, including a lot of Republicans, said that Nixon was guilty of treason and had blood on his hands. Nixon didn't know what Johnson knew about that sabotage and treason. And it led to Nixon then pulling all the shenanigans he did to cheat in his 1972 re-election. Probably the least criminal of his crimes was the Watergate break-in. But it was Watergate, that we all know of, that was the actually the cover-up of Watergate that made Nixon finally resign in order to avoid being impeached. His successor was an inserted guy who never won election for vice president because Nixon's original vice president had to resign because he was indicted and found guilty of fraud and other crimes. This is 50 years ago. The Republicans were doing all this crap 50 years ago. Same crap they're doing now, 50 years ago. President Ford, the inserted guy, first thing he does is he pardons Nixon. Otherwise, Nixon would have went to prison. But instead, he avoided even going to trial or even being indicted. So then what happens? The next guys are like, oh, wow, great. We can just keep doing this. We can keep criming. All of the next guys, by the way, up until today, all of the next Republican presidential candidates, and of course many other, but they're all Republicans. They're like, hey, wow, we can keep criming. So President Ford loses re-election in 1976, and Jimmy Carter becomes president. There was a big debacle with Iran that went back decades, of course, but it came to a head under the Carter administration. Really no fault of the Carter administration. You know how Iran basically in the 1970s looked just like America? Women were allowed to just be out in the open. They were allowed to wear regular clothes. They didn't have to cover their entire body. They were allowed to be people. They were allowed to get educations. They were allowed to be people. Well, the revolution that changed that and made Iran into the horrible place it is now, that those women and many others are protesting against, a whole nother thread moving along right alongside what we're talking about here, but you can see it all through history. During this sort of revolution, some revolutionaries, I guess, if you want to call it that, in Iran, took some American hostages from the American embassy. I'm trying to think of how to not go too deep into this, but it was a big problem, of course, for the Carter administration. Again, Carter had a deal set up to free the hostages in 1980, and the Republicans intervened in that. They went to Iran and changed the deal. There was a fight even in Iran about the deal. There were some that wanted to make the deal, and there were some that didn't. They wanted to go along with the Republicans. Basically, the Republicans did the same thing that Nixon did in 1968. One thing that helped the Republicans commit this next treasonous crime was that Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran and disrupted the deal with Carter in September of 1980. Now Iran was in dire need of many more weapons, and the Republicans struck a deal to sell them what they needed in a meeting in Paris in October 1980 with William Casey and former CIA director and Reagan's running mate, George H.W. Bush. Bill Casey was Reagan's campaign manager. So they have a deal, and they basically say, don't free the hostages until Reagan becomes president. You'll get a much better deal with us than you will with Carter's re-election. Reagan wins the election, but they make a deal to sell arms to Iran, because Iran now needs arms because they're at war with Iraq. It was against the law to sell arms to Iran, but the Reagan administration did it. Then they used the profits of selling those arms to Iran to give it to the contraband in South America. Another thing that was basically breaking a law that the Reagan administration signed into law in 1982. But they started to do this in the mid-'80s. This became the Iran-Contra scandal. In 1988, George H.W. Bush won the presidential election. I'm going to read from an article that was written by Tom Hartman. Christmas Day of 1992. The New York Times featured a screaming, all-caps headline across the top of its front page. Attorney General Bill Barr had covered up evidence of crimes by Reagan and Bush in the Iran-Contra scandal. Earlier that week of Christmas 1992, George H.W. Bush was on his way out of office. Bill Clinton had won the White House the month before, and in a few weeks would be sworn in as president. But Bush's biggest concern wasn't that he'd have to leave the White House to retire back to one of his mansions in Maine or Connecticut or Texas, but rather that he may end up embroiled even deeper in the Iran-Contra treason, and that he and his colleagues may face time in a federal prison after he left office. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh was closing in fast on him and Reagan, and Bush's private records, subpoenaed by the independent counsel's office, were the key to it all. Walsh had been appointed independent counsel in 1986 to investigate the Iran-Contra activities of the Reagan administration and determine if crimes had been committed. Was the Iran-Contra criminal conspiracy limited, as Reagan and Bush insisted, and Reagan said on TV, to the later years in the Reagan presidency? Or had it started in the 1980 presidential campaign against Jimmy Carter with treasonous collusion with the Iranians? Who knew what and when? And what was George H.W. Bush's role in it all? In the years since then, the president of Iran in 1980, Bani Sadr, has gone on record saying that the Reagan campaign reached out to Iran to hold the hostages in exchange for weapons. He told the Christian Science Monitor in 2013, Ayatollah Khomeini and Ronald Reagan had organized a clandestine negotiation, later known as the October Surprise, which prevented the attempts by myself and then U.S. President Jimmy Carter to free the hostages before the 1980 U.S. presidential election took place. The fact that they were not released tipped the results of the election in favor of Reagan. And that wouldn't have just been an impeachable crime. It was treason. Walsh had zeroed in on documents that were in the possession of Reagan's former defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, who all the evidence showed was definitely in on the deal, and President Bush's diary that could corroborate it. Another member of the Reagan administration, Elliott Abrams, had already been convicted of withholding evidence about it from Congress, and he may have more information too if it could be pried out of him before he went to prison. But Abrams was keeping mum, apparently anticipating a pardon. Weinberger, trying to avoid jail himself, was preparing to testify that Bush knew about it and even participated. And Walsh had already, based on information he'd obtained from the investigation into Weinberger, demanded that Bush turn over his diary from the campaign. So Bush called his attorney general at the time in 1992, Bill Barr. That's right. There he is. Same guy that came in to try and avert any attention toward Donald Trump. Bill Barr was the attorney general 30 years ago. 31 years ago, actually, under George H.W. Bush. Barr, along with Bush, was already up to his eyeballs in cover-ups of shady behavior by the Reagan administration, and they were in the midst of another scandal, one having to do with Bush selling weapons of mass destruction to Saddam Hussein, because the Attorney General was already covering up for Bush, Weinberger, and others from the Reagan administration in what came to be known as Iraq-gate. You ever wonder why his son lied about WMDs in Iraq? It's because they were sold illegally to Iraq by his daddy. Okay, going back to 1992. Now, just short of 2 months later, after Iraq-gate broke, Bush was asking Barr for advice on how to avoid another very serious charge in the Iran-Contra crimes. How, he wanted to know, could they shut down Walsh's investigation before Walsh's lawyers got their hands on Bush's diary? In April of 2001, the University of Virginia's Miller Center was compiling oral presidential histories and interviewed Bill Barr about his time as Attorney General in the Bush White House. They brought up the issue of the Weinberger pardon, which put an end to the Iran-Contra investigation and Barr's involvement in it. Turns out Barr was right in the middle of it. Here's what Barr said in 2001. There were some people arguing just for a pardon for Weinberger, and I said, no. In for a penny, in for a pound. I went over and told the president I thought he should not only pardon Caspar Weinberger, but while he's at it, he should pardon about 5 others. Now that's exactly what Bush did. On Christmas Eve, when most Americans were with family instead of watching the news, but the holiday notwithstanding, the result was explosive. So when Bush shut the investigation down by pardoning not only Weinberger, but also Abrams and others involved in the crimes, destroying Walsh's ability to prosecute anybody. The New York Times ran the headline all the way across 4 of the 6 columns on the front page. Bush pardons 6 in Iran affair, aborting a Weinberger trial. Prosecutor assails a cover-up. The second paragraph of that Times story, by David Johnston, by the way, laid it out. Mr. Weinberger was scheduled to stand trial on January 5th on charges that he lied to Congress about his knowledge of the arms sales to Iran and efforts by other countries to help underwrite the Nicaraguan rebels. A case that was expected to focus on Mr. Weinberger's private notes that contain references to Mr. Bush's endorsement of the secret shipments to Iran. But in a single stroke, Mr. Bush, at Barr's suggestion, swept away 1 conviction, 3 guilty pleas, and 2 pending cases, virtually decapitating what was left of Mr. Walsh's effort, which began in 1986. And one would wonder how much it cost the American taxpayers as well. Completely erased by Bill Barr. William Barr. It's time for us to take a break, but this story is not finished. If you remember, we are leading up to what happened in the Durham case, but there's also another thing that happened just yesterday, because things are just spinning out of control, and it goes directly to Trump. Anyway, break time, right? Yeah. I'm Todd Mikkelson. You're listening to A Satellite View. We'll be right back. Todd Mikkelson with A Satellite View. At the end of the last segment, I mentioned that something new happened in our saga with our villain William Barr being the star. We went way back in history in the last segment, and now we're going to kind of recent, but it also is something from, more blast from the past, if you remember, Stormy Daniels. A porn star who's actually, I think, pretty funny on Twitter and stuff like that. She's certainly come through this really well. Quick synopsis off the top of my head. In something like 2005, when Melania, Trump's illegal alien escort, was pregnant with their son, Trump had a sexual interlude with Stormy Daniels. She was thinking, this could help my career. He was thinking, oh God, this woman's so hot. I'm just got. So that happened, and then there was Trump leading, into a presidential election, and his fixer, Michael Cohen, personal lawyer, was assigned to pay Stormy Daniels $130,000 to keep her quiet so that she did not come out with the story. It was kind of coming to a head. Michael Cohen pleaded guilty, went to prison for a little while. Michael Cohen also talked about a lot of other things that are now coming to fruition in the Letitia James case in New York, because it's a lot of fraud, a lot of tax fraud, a lot of bank fraud. Well, the Stormy Daniels thing kind of went away, and we're finding out a little bit why, partially because it's reopening now that Bill Barr is no longer the Attorney General, now that Donald Trump is not telling Bill Barr to meddle in all this stuff he shouldn't be meddling in as Attorney General, because Donald Trump is no longer the President of the United States. I'm going to read from United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He's a Republican, Jeffrey Berman. I'm going to read a little bit from his book. The first time Maine Justice interfered was when the information was being finalized. After Michael Cohen agreed to plead guilty, the charging instrument became an information rather than an indictment. That's just sort of legalese. It was about 40 pages long, and it referenced a person identified as Individual 1 as having acted in concert with Cohen. There was zero doubt as to the identity of Individual 1. It was Donald Trump. Consistent with DOJ guidelines, we first submitted the information to the Public Integrity Section at Maine Justice. They signed off. We then sent a copy to Rod Rosenstein, informing him that Cohen's guilty plea was imminent. The next day, the prosecutor from my office, Jeffrey Berman's office, received a call from Rosenstein's principal deputy, and he was aggressive. Why the length? Why the 40 pages? He wanted to know. He argued that now that Cohen is pleading guilty, we don't need all this description. He proceeded to identify specific allegations that he wanted removed, and almost all of them referenced Individual 1. It quickly became apparent that it wasn't the overall length or detail of the document that concerned DOJ. It was any mention of Individual 1. That's me. That's me. The revised document got edited down to 21 pages from the original 40. It kept all of the charges Cohen was pleading guilty to, but removed certain allegations, including allegations that Individual 1 acted in concert with and coordinated with Cohen on the illegal campaign contributions. Then the first thing Bill Barr does when he becomes the Attorney General the next February of 2019, he calls the prosecutor to challenge the basis of Cohen's guilty plea, as well as the reasoning behind pursuing similar campaign finance charges against other individuals. He told the prosecutor to cease all investigative work on the campaign finance allegations until he, Bill Barr, could determine whether there was a sufficient federal interest in pursuing charges against others. He impeded a state investigation and wanted to dismiss the guilty plea of Michael Cohen because Cohen was the man who implicated Barr's new boss. That's me. I was his boss. But just now, in January of 2023, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office began presenting evidence to a grand jury about Donald Trump's role in paying hush money to Stormy Daniels, the porn star, during his 2016 presidential campaign, laying groundwork for potential criminal charges against the former president. The grand jury was recently impaneled, and the beginning of witness testimony represents a clear signal that the district attorney, whose name is Alvin Bragg, is nearing a decision about whether to charge Trump. Also, just in the last couple days, we got to see the testimony of Trump at his deposition last August in the case the New York Attorney General Letitia James has over Trump and his company's tax and bank fraud case. It could lead to sanctions against him, his involved kids, which would be Eric, Don Jr., and Ivanka, and his company. The grand jury decision in that case could then recommend criminal referrals as well. That's brand new, and it further shows you why we're calling Bill Barr the villain of this story. So now, if you remember the Mueller case, Mueller laid out 10 prosecutable incidents of Donald Trump committing felony obstruction of justice, all to cover up the assistance he was seeking and receiving from Russian oligarchs and the Russian government that ultimately helped him win the 2016 election. Federal Judge Amy Berman Jackson noted that Barr's lies to the American people, to Congress, and to federal judges were so inconsistent with evidence in the record, they are not worthy of credence. A month after Mr. Barr was confirmed as Attorney General in February 2019, the special counsel, Robert Mueller, ended the Russia investigation and turned in his report without charging any Trump associates with engaging in a criminal conspiracy with Moscow over its covert operation to help Mr. Trump win the 2016 election. Now, Bill Barr, before the final report came out, Bill Barr basically came out and said, yeah, this is really not proving any culpability. It's really not proving any guilt. It's really got nothing going on for it. It was a lie. And of course, then Mr. Trump would repeatedly portray that the Mueller report was having found no collusion with Russia. The reality was more complex. In fact, the report detailed numerous links between the Russian government and the Trump campaign, and it established both how Moscow had worked to help Mr. Trump win and how his campaign had expected to benefit from the foreign interference. I'm reading now from a new report in the Washington Post. Egged on by Mr. Trump, Attorney General William Barr set out in 2019 to dig into their shared theory that the Russian investigation likely stemmed from a conspiracy by intelligence or law enforcement agencies. To lead the inquiry, Mr. Trump turned to a hard-nosed prosecutor named John Durham and later granted him special counsel status so that he could carry on after Trump left office. He's opening up an investigation on the investigators. Why did they start investigating the Russia collusion in the 2016 election? Now, the Durham thing is kind of coming to an end after almost 4 years. Far longer than the Russia investigation itself, the Mueller investigation. Mr. Durham's work is coming to an end without uncovering anything like the deep state plot alleged by Mr. Trump and suspected by Mr. Barr. Remember when they said the Durham investigation opened a criminal case because of what they found in the fall of 2019? I remember that, and I remember kind of thinking, oh man, what did they find? Is this going to hurt the whole argument? Because we all know that there was collusion. We now know more about that story. On one of the many trips that Mr. Barr and Mr. Durham took to Europe, they did get some tips from Italian officials. They denied any role in setting off the Russia investigation, but they unexpectedly offered to Mr. Barr and Durham a potentially explosive tip linking Mr. Trump to certain suspected financial crimes. Mr. Barr and Mr. Durham decided that the tip was too serious and credible to ignore. But rather than assign it to another prosecutor, Mr. Barr had Mr. Durham investigate the matter himself. So this is not how it's supposed to work. Mr. Durham never filed charges, and it remains unclear what level of an investigation it was, what steps he took, what he learned, and whether anyone at the White House ever found out. The extraordinary fact that Mr. Durham opened a criminal investigation that included scrutinizing Mr. Trump has remained secret. But in October 2019, a garbled echo became public. The Times reported that Mr. Durham's administrative review of the Russia inquiry had evolved to include a criminal investigation, while saying it was not clear what the suspected crime was. Many other news outlets confirmed the development. So that's what that was. That's what I remember being a little worried about. Remained secret. It was actually evolved into a criminal inquiry about Donald Trump himself. Adding, going beyond the Russia collusion, Mr. Barr, who weighed in publicly about the Durham inquiry at regular intervals in ways that advanced a pro-Trump narrative, chose, in this instance, not to clarify what was really happening. Now, in the midst of this, Mr. Durham and Mr. Barr had not yet given up when a new problem arose. I mean, they basically had a dead end. They weren't finding anything. And then, in early December of 2019, the Justice Department's independent Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, completed his own report on the origins of the Russia investigation. But the broader findings contradicted Mr. Trump's accusations and the rationale for Mr. Durham's inquiry. Mr. Horowitz found no evidence that FBI actions were politically motivated, and he concluded that the investigation's basis had been sufficient to lawfully open it. So Mr. Horowitz does an investigation and said, yeah, there was definite good reason to open this investigation on Russia collusion. But that weekend, Mr. Barr and Mr. Durham decided to weigh in publicly to shape the narrative on their terms. Minutes before the Inspector General's report went online, Mr. Barr issued a statement contradicting Mr. Horowitz's major finding, declaring that the FBI opened the investigation on the thinnest of suspicions. So this is Bill Barr lying to the American people as the Attorney General, saying, don't listen to this guy Horowitz, when actually Horowitz's report would show that, no, it wasn't the thinnest suspicion. There was Russian collusion. It was very clear, and it needed to be investigated. So this is Bill Barr doing the same thing he did in 1992, lying to the American public as the Attorney General. By summer 2020, it was clear that the hunt for evidence supporting Mr. Barr's hunch about intelligence abuses had failed. But he waited until after the 2020 election to publicly concede that there had turned out to be no sign of foreign government activity and that the CIA had stayed in its lane after all. By the spring and summer of 2020, with Mr. Trump's re-election campaign in full swing, the Durham investigation's failure to deliver scalps in time for the election began to erode Mr. Barr's relationship with Trump. Trump lashed out in a Fox interview, asserting that top FBI and intelligence officials had been caught in the single biggest political crime in the history of our country. The biggest ever. So now he's turning on Barr and Durham. And against that background, Barr and Durham did not shut down their inquiry when the search for intelligence abuses hit a dead end. Still, with the Inspector General's inquiry complete, they turned to a new rationale, a hunt for a basis to accuse the Clinton campaign. So they tried to work on that a little bit before the 2020 election. That didn't really work out. By summer of 2020, with Election Day approaching, Mr. Barr pressed Mr. Durham to draft a potential interim report centered on the Clinton campaign and FBI gullibility or willful blindness. He's trying to get something out before the election. That is a lie. It's a lie to the American people. He is the Attorney General. He's trying to get Durham to put out a preliminary report before the actual report, because the actual report is going to show that the whole Durham investigation was a sham and a lie. So they wanted to wait to do that until after Election Day. Hey, can you just write a report that says what we want it to say, and it might appease Trump, and get it out before the election? Now, Mr. Durham had a long time second in command, decades long. Nora Danahy. On September 10th, 2020, Nora Danahy, she discovered that other members of the team had written a draft report that Mr. Durham had not told her about. She erupted. She told Mr. Durham that no report should be issued before the investigation was complete, and especially not just before an election. She denounced the draft for taking disputed information at face value. Disputed information being a lot of documents that a lot of people within the team said was Russian disintelligence, disinformation. So that's what she's talking about in disputed information at face value. She sent colleagues a memo detailing those concerns, and she resigned after working diligently and loyally under Durham for decades. She had enough. There were also 2 other resignations for similar reasons. There are a lot more details in this that are absolutely unbelievable. Obviously, I could talk about it forever, but we need to take another break. So we're going to take a break. This story goes on forever. There's other things to talk about. So let's take a break, and we'll come right back. You're listening to A Satellite View. I'm Todd Mikkelson. A Satellite View, Todd Mikkelson speaking at you. I think let's take a transition. Enough about our villain, Bill Barr. I think we did a successful deep dive, a Satellite View, far look back into the past, and so much going on right now this week. One thing that is kind of hilarious to watch, actually, is Trump is the one who's ruining DeSantis. He's, of course, feeling threatened by DeSantis because he's looking at polls and stuff. He's looking at the fact that he couldn't get, the venue for his newest rally was less than 200, basically in like a gymnasium. He doesn't care about anything anymore. He's just well, he cares about, I think he's scared that he's going to go to prison. He's got so many things coming in on him. We've talked about a lot of it here on this episode and the previous episode, down in Georgia, up in New York. He's putting out things, like DeSantis closed down Florida. He said he kept it open, but he didn't. He was very, very loving with the vaccines. Even though Trump was also, he was bragging about inventing the vaccines. But now he's saying DeSantis was one of the biggest shutdown in Florida. So he's trying to hurt DeSantis. DeSantis isn't even running yet, but of course he thinks he's going to run. DeSantis is basically being a Nazi right now. What's going on in Florida in schools? They say they want kids to learn, but they don't want kids to have access to any books. Any books. He's saying that these books can indoctrinate kids. So I need to look at each and every book, and I will allow only the books that I want to allow. Does that sound like projection to you? Does it sound like he's the one who wants to do the indoctrination of the kids in Florida? You've seen the photos, maybe you haven't, of the Nazis taking books out of libraries in Germany in the late 30s. So with DeSantis, did we Nazi this coming? Ron DeSantis is a Nazi. Let's see what else is going on this week. The committees are now going on. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's now on the Homeland Security Committee. Kevin McCarthy is the weakest and dumbest, certainly Speaker of the House. I was just going to say person. But he thinks he is not a leader. He's a follower. He's just sucking up to Marjorie Taylor Greene, to all these horrible people in Congress. So the Comptroller General for the Government Accountability Office, Gene Dodaro, was being questioned by the Homeland Security Committee. And Marjorie Taylor Greene has to ask about CRT. Do you know how much money was spent on CRT in Illinois alone? And he's like, on what? CRT, it's a racist indoctrination of kids, telling white kids that their white skin isn't as important as black and brown skinned. She said that in almost, I saw video, going off the top of my head, but it's very close. You can watch the video. It's very close to what I'm saying right now. He said, no, I don't know. Well, in Illinois, $5 billion with a B, $5 billion was given to $5 billion was given to an elementary school for CRT. You need to look into this. You need to look into this. Do you know how much money was spent on Drag Queen Story Hour? He's like, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Because he's dumbfounded. These Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan, Ted Cruz, I don't put in the same thing because this isn't his first rodeo. Jim Jordan's been here for a long time too, but especially Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Andy Biggs, what's his name from Philadelphia, Gozar, all these freak shows. You can tell that they really believe that America agrees with them. That they think the vast majority of Americans agree with them. Now she's finally here for the American people. The American people have been waiting for years, decades, centuries. I would say she would use the word millennium, but I don't think she knows what that means. The American people have been waiting for years for somebody in Congress to point out the fact that $5 billion in COVID relief dollars was given to a single elementary school for CRT. It's just layers of complete crazy BS that she believes. And she believes the majority of Americans believe it and have been waiting for her to come and say it. On TV, in the Capitol. My God. As a matter of fact, there's a poll. You know what I think of polls. You know, you take them or leave them. You got to consider who they're able to talk to. And that makes this even stronger. It's probably a higher number because, again, Gen Z doesn't pick up their cell phone if they get a call from somebody they don't know. How can you poll a Gen Z person? You can't, really. They were not I think it was proven in the 2022 election, certainly, it was proven that all these polls were completely wrong because Gen Z turned out and voted and, stamped out the red tsunami. They created a blue tsunami, but it was not shown in any polling. So this poll, considering the fact that Gen Z is not a part of this polling, this poll still says 73% of American voters do not think that the new Republican Congress represents America. 73%. Think about if they actually could have gotten answers from Gen Z. Would it be closer to 99.9%? I'm meeting with Joe Biden. Kevin McCarthy goes to meet with Joe Biden. I'm gonna make him negotiate. Joe Biden, in the meantime, says, "Hey, I told him, show me your budget, I'll show you mine." But McCarthy doesn't have a budget. Things have been floated, a 30% sales tax. We're going to get rid of all income tax and we're going to put a 30% sales tax. They complain about the price of eggs right now. Well, okay, they want to raise the price of eggs by 30%. By the way, eggs, first of all, aren't very expensive. They're maybe less than $1 more than they normally are. We had the largest outbreak of the avian flu, the bird flu, I think ever in history, in recorded history. That's a big part of the reason that eggs are a little bit more expensive now than they were, 2 years ago. But Republicans want to raise the price of eggs by another 30%. They want to raise the price of everything that you buy 30%. If you go to the grocery store and you're buying a week's worth of groceries and it costs $100, they want you to pay $130 so that billionaires can pay no taxes. That's what they're looking for. Today, yesterday, I don't know, within the last couple of days, now that they have the power, they put up a measure on the House floor denouncing socialism, just so that they could then say, these Democrats didn't vote against socialism. This is what they're spending their time doing. Another thing, they want to cut funding for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You know who's dying? By 500 people per day still. I'm speaking at you from the beginning of February 2023. 500 Americans per day are still dying from COVID. And you know what lineage, what affiliation they are? They're GOP maggots because they're the ones who are not vaccinated. And the GOP wants to cut funding for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Always the problem is more valuable than the solution with Republicans. The border? No, we don't want to actually come up. Democrats have been asking us for decades to work with them to try and come up with comprehensive immigration policy. We don't want comprehensive immigration policy. We want a problem at the borders. We want a problem with immigration so that we can run campaigns on it. That's what we want. We don't want a solution. We want the problem. Yeah. Well, hope to talk to you very soon. Thank you so much for listening. See you soon.
You've been listening to A Satellite View with Todd Mikkelson. Go to toddmikkelson.com for links and more information.